to be that Jamaica's national identification system is the primary source of verifiable and authentic identity assurance for every citizen and every person ordinarily resident in Jamaica. And the goal was to establish this system by 2017. Of course, as I said, there were some hiccups. Well, we are back in 2021, and there was the return of NIDS with a joint select committee to which submissions were invited. Now, the Issachar lectures have been held over the last 10 years. It's amazing to think we've been doing this for 10 years. Some of our previous topics explored include the historicity of Jesus, Marcus Garvey and the Christian tradition in Jamaica, science and faith, friends or foes. And since June 2020, due to COVID, we have migrated to an online platform. And this is our 6th virtual lecture. In June 2020, we looked at life with COVID, health, law, and liberty. Then in August of the same year, Black Lives Matter, emancipation reflections. Then in November, Reformation then and now. In December 2020, on the occasion of the International Human Rights Day, the topic was Common Sense for the Commonwealth, Resisting British Totalitarianism, a review of the right to freedom of expression. And lastly, in March 2021, we hosted a symposium entitled Moral Inputs, Mortal Outcomes, Bridging the Gap Between Values and Crime. Continuing that list of somewhat controversial, but I dare say interesting topics, today's lecture is Uncovering the Hidden Facts about NIDS, the National ID System. I invite you to visit Issachar Foundation Jamaica YouTube channel to view and listen to past lectures. These lectures are always information rich and inspiring. This evening's lecture will be in like manner, I have no doubt. After our presentation, there will be ample opportunity for questions and answers and for addressing your comments. Please ensure once again that your mics remain muted throughout the lecture. And when you post your questions in the chat, they will be acknowledged and answered to the best of our ability at the termination of the talk. Now to our presenter. Mrs. Helene Coley-Nicholson, attorney at law, is a Christian advocate who utilizes the law and media as tools for change. With over 38 years experience as a media practitioner and 16 years in law, Helene is currently president of the Lawyers Christian Fellowship Jamaica, director and legal counsel, the Press Association of Jamaica, past director and legal counsel, member of the Communication and Information Advisory Committee of the Jamaica National Commission for United Nations Educational, Scientific and Cultural Organization, aka UNESCO, and a Justice of the Peace, among many other public service posts. She's also a lecturer in human rights at the university level. Well qualified to give this talk, indeed, and we're very privileged to have her. While working as a journalist, Helene was a recipient of the prestigious Reuters Journalism Fellowship to Oxford University. Her syndicated stories on environmental issues were published in the electronic and print media for audiences in the Caribbean, Europe, and continental Africa. Helene currently operates a general civil law practice. He's married to Dr. Clive Nicholson, a medical doctor for 31 years. They have 2 daughters and a new granddaughter. Very happy to have Helene here, a privilege to have her, and I will now invite her to speak. But before she does so, she wishes the audience to see 2 brief videos as a precedent to her presentation. So now we will look at those videos. Thank you very much and enjoy the Issachar lecture.
Today, your information is more exposed than ever. When you shop, bank, or browse online, you're vulnerable to cybercriminals. More threats demand more protection. That's why Norton and LifeLock are now one, combining device security, VPN for online privacy, and LifeLock identity theft protection, backed by a $1 million protection package. Get all-in-one protection for $9.99.
Nearly 110 million people were victims of cybercrime last year. There was a victim of identity theft every 3 seconds.
Somebody ran over $50,000 in my name.
This hacker, he was able to make it appear that all the keystrokes are coming from my location.
It felt like my world was turned upside down and not certain how to get out of it.
Did you know that cyber criminals can see your online activity over Wi-Fi? Or load spyware onto your devices? Or steal your identity from online records? You live so much of your life online, it's hard to know how to even begin to protect yourself. That's why Norton 360 with LifeLock makes it easy. With a VPN to help keep your online activity private, and LifeLock identity.
Well, sometimes the technology fails and we simply have to proceed. And it's very interesting that the technology has in fact failed. And we will touch on that as a talking point during this presentation this evening. So, welcome to the new world, the fourth industrial revolution, where, as you just heard, much of our lives are lived online, a virtual reality where we purchase goods and services, apply for, gain employment, and perform our jobs, do banking and investment, access education, healthcare, social welfare, including pensions, apply for passports, register to vote, register births and deaths, socialize, entertain, meet, find partners, and even fall in love, and worse now with the COVID pandemic. It's all made possible by a global electronic identification infrastructure, which requires digitalization of citizens' identification documents. Good evening. Thanks to my friends at the Issachar Foundation for inviting me to speak this evening. I must acknowledge Brother Leslie Buckland and his daughter Sarah for initially unearthing a lot of the information I'll be sharing with you this evening. Jamaica's National Identification System, NIDS, will be one of several digital identification systems with a single database being implemented in countries around the world. Each initiative is identified by a different name. Example, in Jamaica, it's called the NIDS. You hear about the Aadhaar in India, and there are others in Malawi, Peru, Pakistan, and elsewhere. Now, the purpose of this presentation is to continue to ask questions which have so far been ignored. These questions were posed in written submissions of the Lawyers Christian Fellowship to the Joint Select Committee of Parliament, which reviewed the NIDS bill. Our questions have not been answered. Without answers, it is arguable that Jamaicans have not in fact consented to a national identification program whose ultimate aim may be integration of our economy into a supranational global economy where citizens' identity information is owned by unelected forces beyond our government's control. Prime Minister Andrew Holness, in an address to Parliament last year, said Jamaica needs to fast-track the new national identification system, NIDS legislation and infrastructure to succeed in the fourth industrial revolution. He promised that digital IDs will foster increased financial and economic inclusion and have a variety of civic and economic uses. Government has stressed that the system will be safe, secure, and reliable, perhaps if you have $9.99 US for the ordinary citizen. That it will transform the efficacy and transparency of interactions between the state and citizens to strengthen identity security, reduce identity fraud, and combat crime. Well, NIDS 2 is different from NIDS 1, to which Dr. West referred earlier. You will recall that the previous law, we'll call it NIDS 1, the National Identification and Registration Act, NIDS 1, was struck down by the court as unconstitutional in April 2019. One of the major concerns about NIDS 1 was that citizens and persons ordinarily resident in Jamaica were compelled by law to enroll in the system. Failure to do so was a criminal offense. Without a national identification under NIDS 1, persons would be unable to do business and access goods and services, including services as fundamental as healthcare and education. Lest we forget, the draconian NIDS 1 legislation was passed in November 2017 by the Lower House of Parliament after being returned from the Senate with 168 amendments. At the start of the sitting, the Prime Minister declared that there'd be no debate that day because members on both sides had not yet had a chance to review the bill. Later that evening, when the opposition PNP walked out of the House, government took advantage of its numbers and passed the bill into law. It was a stunning turn of events which left us breathless and asking why? Why the haste? And why the timelines for implementing the NIDS? Again, stressing the urgency, a new NIDS bill was tabled in Parliament December 2020 and sent to a joint select committee to be considered. The Lawyers Christian Fellowship, on the invitation of the Joint Select Committee, made written submissions in which we asked questions in the hope of getting answers, but none has been forthcoming. Our questions, which we continue to ask, come against the background of the source of the funding for the NIDS, as well as a global agenda being pursued by the multilateral financial institutions and the United Nations. But before we get there, let's talk a little bit about what is NIDS and highlight some of the differences between NIDS 1 and NIDS 2. So NIDS generally will be a cradle-to-grave biometric identification system. Biometrics are body measurements and calculations related to human characteristics. NIDS 2 will use minimum biometrics, that's fingerprints, facial image, manual signature if you're over 18, which is in contrast to NIDS 1, which required far more. Under NIDS 2, enrollment with the National Registration Authority will be voluntary, and an individual can cancel the registration. A unique national identification number and an ID card will be assigned to each person who enrolls. The issue of consent and security of citizens' identification data were major concerns for the court and persons opposing NIDS 1. Speaking in Parliament last year, September, about NIDS 2, the Prime Minister gave an interesting definition of consent, which, according to him, means that individuals knowingly register for and use the digital ID with knowledge of what personal data will be captured and how it will be used. That definition is interesting because consent is not mere knowledge, which is the limit that the Prime Minister placed on it. It is, in fact, agreement which should be actual, continuous, and capable of being withdrawn without punishment, such as being denied access to goods and services. It should not be coerced, and in other words, as inconvenient as it might be, there should be alternatives available to ensure inclusion of citizens who are not part of the digital society. As it relates to ownership of the identity data, according to the Prime Minister, identity information is the property of the individual, and his or her consent is required for it to be collected, stored, and used by anyone. So let's get to the money, the source of the funding, and the real agenda. What is it? The Inter-American Development Bank, the IDB, which has an agreement for mutual reliance regarding procurement with the World Bank, works closely with that institution, that is the World Bank, to leverage each other's capacities and implement projects. That's how they put it on the World Bank's website. The World Bank, in turn, is an institution of the United Nations. Jamaica has borrowed over 1.33 billion, with a B, dollars from the Inter-American Development Bank to develop and implement the NIDS. For more than a decade now, the World Bank has been engaged in studying the global interconnectivity of national IDs and funding something which it calls ID for Development, or ID4D for short. The United Nations itself has a counterpart program with similar objectives called ID 2020. Given the relationship between the IDB, the World Bank, and the United Nations, the Lawyers Christian Fellowship asked the Parliamentary Committee the following questions. Is there a relationship between the NIDS and the World Bank's ID4D Global Infrastructure for Citizen IDs program and the UN's ID 2020 program? If there is, will our government have complete autonomy and sovereign control over our national identification system and database in light of certain statements made by the Directorate at the UN, which I will share with you later? But first, I'll say a little bit about those two programs. Pay attention, though, to the 2020 in the title of the UN program. I believe it holds the key, which explains why Jamaica has been in such a rush to implement the NIDS. The United Nations has been sponsoring electronic or EID conferences for more than a decade, where government and other delegates from academia, science, and business from all around the world come together to discuss the global EID infrastructure based on digitalization of citizens' ID documents. After the 2016 UN ID 2020 conference, the website published the summit outcomes, stating, "No government owns identity." I'm quoting here. There was widespread consensus among ID 2020 attendees that identity is both a fundamental human right and a necessary prerequisite for the success of the Sustainable Development Goals. Broad understanding that no single organization or government can own identity, but instead that a public-private partnership is needed to bring together the broad group of stakeholders, provide coordination, and ensure that the best technological innovations are implemented in ways that are appropriate, secure, and sustainable. There were sweeping commitments from conference attendees to contribute towards the shared goal of universal digital identity. Dakota Gruner, ID 2020's executive director, said, quote, "The exact details of how a new global identity system would work are still to be worked out," end quote. She imagines it would evolve into a database overseen by an international non-aligned organization like the United Nations. It would be flexible enough to encompass every country's existing rules and structures, but accessible to individuals with their own smartphones. ID 2020 is aimed at achieving UN Sustainable Development Goal SDG 16.9, which is to provide the world's population with digital identity, including free birth registrations, so from cradle to grave. Global digital identification is said to be key to attaining many of the other SDG goals, which we have been hearing about for many years. Accordingly, the United Nations and the multilateral financial institutions are moving towards a global electronic ID system for all member states. 2020 was the original target year for member states to be ready with an electronic ID system. 2030 is the latest deadline for everyone on Earth to be registered in a national identification system. Ms. Gruner is on record as saying she believes refugees could be a useful test audience before expanding new ID infrastructure more widely. And they currently have the infrastructure to track refugees globally using biometric data in the central database in Geneva, where they work in conjunction with the UN High Commission for Refugees. So that's ID 2020. Let's talk a little bit about World Bank ID4D, which among other things aims to do the following. And I'll list them as listed on the website. Later on, I'll put some links in the chat so that you can visit the websites and see the information for yourself. So some of the aims of ID4D: to develop a global eID infrastructure based on the digitalization of citizen ID documents, to facilitate global interconnectivity of national IDs, to advance single country engagements, as well as develop and support regional approaches to ensure that identification systems are established in an integrated, interoperable manner, to accelerate regional integration through safe and orderly migration, mutual recognition, and infrastructure for common digital markets. Encourage countries to build systems that allow for the mutual recognition of IDs and access to services across borders in an increasingly mobile and interconnected world. The World Bank says, while ID4D is advancing single country engagements, it is also developing and supporting regional approaches to ensure that identification systems are established in an integrated, interoperable manner to accelerate regional integration through safe and orderly migration, mutual recognition, infrastructure for common digital markets. There is value in encouraging countries to build systems that allow for the mutual recognition of IDs and access to services across borders in an increasingly mobile and interconnected world. And the motto for the World Bank's Identification for Development ID4D program is, quote, reaching the SDGs as Sustainable Development Goals of the United Nations, one identity, one country at a time. So again, we ask, is there a relationship between the NIDS and the World Bank's ID4D Global Infrastructure for Citizen ID program and the United Nations ID 2020 program? If there is, will our government have complete autonomy and sovereign control over our national identification system and database in light of conflicting statements made by Jamaica's Prime Minister Holness about identity information being the property of the individual? And Dagota Gruner of the United Nations, who says there's international agreement. And by the way, I'm sure that we would have been sending delegations to these ongoing United Nations conferences where they say there's been overwhelming support for the notion, as Gruner has put it, that no single organization or government can own identity. So against that background, we look at the promises that NIDS is vital for Jamaica to succeed in the fourth industrial revolution and foster increased financial and economic inclusion, that it will be safe, secure, and reliable, and transform efficiency and transparency of government, strengthen identity security, reduce identity fraud, and combat crime. Well, what has been the real world experience? Perhaps you've come across some of these stories. If you Google, you find a lot of information about cyber crimes and hacking. And so let's look at some of those stories. Let's look first of all at stories coming out of Nigeria. There's a story out of Nigeria. Evidence of duplication of identity cards in states which implement national identity, prevalence of false national ID cards. Forgery is a booming business in Lagos. In the United Kingdom, new ID cards were supposed to have been unforgeable, but it took an expert 12 minutes to clone one, program it with false data, and it was reported in an article in the UK by one Steve Bogan. In Kenya, they've had experience with massive fraud in national identification cards. The fraud was unearthed major national issues as a result, and national events being manipulated as a result of the major fraud, massive fraud, hundreds of thousands of ID cards in circulation, purportedly belonging to individuals who are non-existent. Hacking in South Korea was said to have cost $1 billion after hackers raided the national ID database. What about reducing terrorism, improving national security? Well, Spanish ID card did not stop the Madrid train bombers some years ago. A British ID card would not have stopped the London bombings in July of 2005. And so it seems that the homegrown terrorists and the suicide bombers are not at all deterred by, and the incidents are not diminished by production of national identification cards. Rather than stopping ID theft, ID cards are in fact said by experts likely to increase the problem, because this single unified and trusted identifier will be something that is really worth forging. And already we hear about criminal gangs having compromised the chip and pin technology, which is, I think, in some of our ID or banking cards, credit cards, debit cards, and the new RFID technology, that's radio frequency identifiers, in place in some passports, have been read by illegal scanners at 30 paces away. Christians in Iraq and in China are complaining that the data is being used to discriminate against them. Articles in Iraq's single national ID legislation discriminate against religious groups. The law has turned into a form of discrimination against non-Muslim minorities. Article 26 of that law includes two provisions that set the foundation for a systematic discrimination against minorities, such as Christians, which may end their presence in the country, which is the whole point. A non-Muslim may switch his religion according to the law. A minor is registered as a Muslim following a conversion of any of the parents to Islam. This provision means that only non-Muslims can convert their religion to Islam according to the law, while Muslims cannot convert their religion. Moreover, a child born within a marriage between a Muslim and a non-Muslim should take on the Muslim religion regardless of the gender of the Muslim parent. This means that if one of the parents converts to Islam, the child will automatically become a Muslim. So against that background, against the assurance by our Prime Minister that our NIDS, when it comes to pass, because it appears to have the support of both sides of the Parliament, the opposition as well as the government side, we are saying that there are some non-negotiables. We've been given the assurance, and so we want, in fact, it to be truly voluntary. That is, enrollment in the program must be truly voluntary. There must be the continued validity of other forms of government-issued identification. And the lack of a particular form of identification cannot be the basis for denial of entitlements. The need to prioritize inclusion by ensuring that the lack of a particular form of ID or any other particular form of ID cannot be the basis for denial of any service, public or private. The need for robust data protection and privacy policies, the independence and degree of discretion ceded to enforcing authorities under the Act must be scrutinized to effectively curb their ability to misuse citizens' identification information. And data collection must be limited to providing official identification only. As I close, there's a thoughtful article that I recommend to you. It was written by Professor Sean Thorpe, who is the head of School of Computing and Information Technology at the University of Technology, Jamaica, the immediate past president of the Jamaica Computer Society, in one of our daily newspapers. It was published in June of 2021, and the headline was Defending Against Cyber Attacks. I do recommend it. It carries warnings to the Jamaican government as it continues to pursue the implementation of the NIDS. And it's very sobering to read the cautions as well as the references to incidents of cyber attacks, hacking, and just how insecure the system can potentially be. So again, the purpose of the presentation today was really just to ask questions which have been ignored. And I do believe that although the government says the NIDS is going to be by consent, it can't truly be by agreement of the Jamaican public without these questions being answered. So thanks for the opportunity. And I do look forward to all of us discussing the issues that were raised and possibly answering the questions. I'm not an expert on the technology or on the NIDS by any stretch of the imagination. I'm simply sharing information which I found interesting and useful, and I hope that you also did too. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Helene, for that presentation. Certainly, I hope that our audience listened closely, would think deeply, and act wisely concerning this issue. The floor is now open for your questions, which I hope you would have placed in the chat so I can have access to them. But I want to start off by posing two questions. One, at what time on the NIDS 2, at what time will the NIDS be, someone be registered? Will it be at birth by involving the RGD in the NIDS bill? Will the registration occur at birth? Because to me, that goes to consent, if it happens at birth, because a minor cannot consent to that. And secondly, would a legal challenge against NIDS 2 now, would it prevail in the same way as the challenge against NIDS 1 prevail? Would a legal challenge prevail? And on what grounds could such a challenge be based? So those are my two questions.
You do have a valid point about whether or not a baby at birth on the breast can consent. And it is to be with the consent of the registrant. So one would have to look at the terms of the bill, which is going through Parliament. And I do know that the JCHS had done a submission on the text and the content of the actual bill itself. Concerning, so I'll reserve that because I'm focusing today on the issues that were raised. The legal challenge, I think, given what has been said about it being by consent, and also the assurances and the actual content of the bill itself, we would have to see the implementation first, and also the regulations that would be companion to the bill to see whether or not it is truly voluntary, whether or not persons would be penalized when in fact they are failed to present the NIDS that they may have enrolled for, or have failed to enroll and present, let's say, a passport or a driver's license, as they're accustomed to doing now.
Thank you very much. So I gather then that unlike NIDS 1, which was challenged preemptively from being implemented, NIDS 2 would have to be challenged after it's actually implemented on the grounds of what is being done at the time, unlike NIDS 1, which they prevented from being implemented. That's what you're saying, basically.
NIDS 2 is quite different in terms of the intrusiveness, the nature of the data, biometric information that is being collected. The fact that it is not mandatory, there is no punishment per se stipulated in the bill, in the law, for failure to register, and so on.
Okay, thank you very much. Well, one question that came up in the chat, I don't know if you'll answer this one, Helene, I'm looking forward to your answer. Are the vaccines, I know by that is meant the COVID vaccines, are the vaccines related to NIDS?
Are the vaccines, you know, Dr. West, you are a doctor. And I know that there are a lot of theories about why we are going down the road of almost mandating people to take vaccines. They're being cajoled, they're being coerced to take the vaccine. But I don't want to venture there. Unless someone wants to, I would hesitate to make a direct connection.
Okay, thank you. Well, you know, Sherlock Holmes said, I believe, that once you have decided on what is impossible, everything else is probable. This is what I would say. Okay, another question that comes in is that, is the government going ahead with NIDS 2? Is it a done deal? Is it a fait accompli? Or is there any room still for dissent now?
I've always felt that government is for the people, by the people, notwithstanding what it appears like. So government rules with the consent of the people. And I did say that this NIDS bill seems to have support on both sides of the aisle. But the parliament is still accountable to the people of Jamaica, to the electorate. The only room that I see now to turn it back is for people to make their voices heard, to insist on our questions being answered, and not to be brushed aside and disregarded by parliamentarians who are hell-bent on going down a particular road that they have yet to discuss with the citizens whom they represent. It disturbs me that these discussions really have been taking place at the international level for quite some time. In fact, I think it would have been conceptualized from the first United Nations Summit on Sustainable Development, which would have been from the early 1990s. And so eventually they would have had the World Summit on Sustainable Development. And then increasingly you're hearing about Sustainable Development Goals. And we have been sending delegations to these conferences. And there has been very little discussion at the local level, and I can speak for Jamaica, but I suspect it also applies to other countries in the Caribbean, where I suspect many of us here have not heard about sustainable SDG 6.9, 16.9, I think it is, that there ought to be digital identification for every person on the planet, previously by 2020 and now by 2030. I'd be interested to know how many persons, if they could indicate perhaps in the chat, how many persons would have known that we have committed to that objective. So we, I think, need to ask some questions of our government, because we've not had a discussion. We've not had this discussion. And to the extent that we've not had this discussion, it doesn't appear that we have all the information in order to make an informed decision as to where we want our country or economies to go.
Yeah, okay, well, we have some other questions. Thank you for that. Some persons have indicated in the chat that it's news to them, this SDG, they knew nothing about it. So we have had 2 responses so far, neither person knew about it. Here's a question. What action can a citizen take if a private business, after the NIDS comes into effect? What action can a citizen take if a private business mandates use of the NIDS to engage with them, to goods and services with them? What action can a citizen take?
One of the interesting differences between NIDS 1 and NIDS 2 is that under NIDS 1, we would not have been able to sue to pursue our right to be treated without discrimination, and with equality. And the Constitution, the Jamaican Constitution, was amended in 2011. And one of the wonderful things about the amendment in 2011 is that it allowed the citizens to sue to enforce their human rights, their fundamental human rights. Citizen against citizen, citizen against the government. And so to the extent that there is a law that, well, it wouldn't be a law, it wouldn't be a practice of perhaps a merchant or maybe a government agency that is denying entitlement to goods and services or benefits, or refusing to do business with a particular individual. I would think that in those circumstances, you could actually bring a lawsuit, a claim in civil court to uphold your rights, and not to be discriminated against on the basis that you did not present a form of identification. I think, however, that one has to bear in mind how practical is it and how likely is it that individuals are in fact going to go to all of that trouble or even have the resources or the knowledge to pursue their rights in that way. And so in order for us to ensure that persons are aware, we really need to spread the word that NIDS 1 and NIDS 2 are different insofar as under the old NIDS you couldn't sue, but under the new NIDS, yes, there is scope for you to sue. And if there is scope for you to sue, then if there's a business that is enforcing, whether it's a government entity or a private sector entity, that is acting in a discriminatory fashion and excluding people from accessing goods or services, that people are aware that it's happening, that you have groupings of persons coming together and acting together to keep themselves informed and possibly to combine in order to instruct perhaps an attorney to act on their behalf and to put a stop to that sort of practice wherever it may occur.
Okay, thank you very much. I just want to acknowledge two comments. One comment was that there are several ways to make something mandatory. One is just a de facto kind of mandatory, or making life very difficult without the thing. So that was a comment I think made by Brittany, that you can make a thing mandatory by making life very, very difficult without it. So we acknowledge that comment. And then there's a question, can the voluntary nature of NIDS 2, as you said, can that really be governed and retained by the Jamaican government when there's such a close and live connection to the UN and other international bodies? Can the government of Jamaica really act to retain the voluntary nature of it? What do you think?
Well, just to comment on what Brittany said previously, that's what I was getting at when I was saying we need to keep each other informed. We need to act as a community to ensure that it does not become practice, because I think what is going to happen is that it is going to be surreptitious. It's going to happen as it's just going to happen. You're going to find one day you get up, just like the Berlin Wall, the person got up overnight, it had been constructed. You're going to find that people are demanding that you present them with this NIDS. Yes? And the only way to resist it is to push back. Life is going to get very difficult unless we push back on it. The issue about
the government being able to retain its voluntary nature.
Well, that is the question that we were asking. And that's the question we put in our parliamentary submissions. And unfortunately, I understand a lot of entities and agencies were given time to present, but having been invited to make written submissions, there was not the time found to allow us to come to present, us being the Lawyers Christian Fellowship, and we got no response from the parliamentary subcommittee. So at this point, we continue to ask the question, and we hope that by making this presentation today, our voice will be amplified, and perhaps somebody here on this platform will be able to assist us with the answer.
Okay, so one of our audience members has asked whether this group, the Issachar Foundation, would host a similar meeting with members of the government so they can answer these questions that you've asked. Well, I think we would be happy to do that if we could find someone who would come to answer them. Certainly, we would have no objection whatsoever to doing that. If someone from the government side would like to come and answer Helene's very apt and very relevant questions. I'm sure we would look forward to that. Just a reminder, you can put your questions in the chat so that we can address them. So far, nobody in the audience admits to having known previously about the SDG, the connection between the identity, the global identity and SDG 2030. Nobody seems to have known about that. So we just want to invite once again to put your questions in the chat or your comments, and we'll acknowledge them.
What about the existence of the World Bank's ID4D program or the United Nations ID 2020 program? You know?
Yes. So Dr. Daniel Thomas has a comment that he has found the response of the government to the submissions of the Love March movement to be quite lacking. So he asks, what is the next step if the government proceeds without answering the questions of the electorate? Because proceeding in that way, he thinks, would make the consultation process a farce if they simply proceeded without acknowledging or answering the questions put forward by groups such as LCF and Love March movement.
Well, the next step must be that each of us here considers ourselves an ambassador to spread the word and to say, well, did you know, say to somebody who wasn't on this platform, did you know so-and-so? This is what I've learned. Because all of us, individually and collectively, we have a responsibility to participate actively in what is described as a democracy. And I have thoughts on whether or not it really is. But be that as it may, we either participate or we don't. To the extent that we do participate, then we have created a possibility that there may be a response. And so I would encourage us all to ask the questions now that we know some more about the context and what's happening globally. But I do think that it's a reasonable conclusion to draw that the urgency of the United Nations has affected the urgency with which our own government has approached the NIDS legislation and what it is doing.
Yes, certainly you have raised quite well, Helen, the issue of sovereignty, national sovereignty, which seems definitely to be threatened by this new NIDS 2. Someone has asked, is it possible that NIDS 1 was proposed as too intrusive and it failed on that ground? NIDS 1, failed on the grounds of its intrusive nature and its involuntary, its mandatory nature. NIDS 2 is said to be less intrusive, but is it possible that the government could amend NIDS 2 after to legislatively amend it to make it as intrusive as NIDS 1? Is that possible?
I think it is, because it is ordinary legislation which requires just a majority in Parliament. And so the answer to that is yes.
You can. Okay. Then another question, which I think you might have addressed partially, if not fully. How can we hold the government accountable in this matter? What are the ways in which we can hold them accountable?
We have to make our voices heard. I think especially with the COVID-19 pandemic and the fact that we're not accustomed to meeting and to talking and communicating in the ways that we would previously. And also because although we have so much information abounding, we're really becoming more and more individualistic, alienated from each other, so that our collective voices are not as strong as it could possibly be. But we need to re-energize, to renew that community spirit and concern for what is happening in the nation, and find ways of combining and expressing it and getting government to respond and other stakeholders to respond. Notice that these conferences that have been happening at the United Nations have been happening with private sector, business, academia in attendance, that there are people who in Jamaica would consider themselves to be the thought leaders, to be the captains of industry. The persons who own and control media, I'm sure, are among them, who would have information but would have been very careful about what it is that they chose to share. And so there are people who have information. We need to be more proactive in tapping into information. now that we have shared this, how many persons here are going to actually go and do their own research? The information is there. Let us not simply consume media as we are accustomed to consuming it, which is really to dull our senses and to escape, but to use media as a tool to find the information, to have it inform our opinions, and to participate in discussions. Nowadays, social media is just so wide open for us to do and to influence. And so it really is about us finding the will.
Okay, thank you. Well, I think we're going to be doing the last couple of questions now, certainly, and they're all linked in some way. One person asked or asserted, posited, we need to embrace some kind of ID. If not, it would be a free-for-all. That's a comment of one person. And I want you to listen to all three before you address them, because they can be addressed together, Helene. Secondly, someone said, could we just abandon any NIDS and have no social registration at all? Is that feasible? That we just abandon the whole NIDS process and have no social registration? And thirdly, Alvin Bailey asked, should NIDS be simply done away with? Is this what JCHS and LCF and LMM, is this what we are proposing, that NIDS be simply done away with? So those are the three last comments, questions that I would like you to address, Helene.
Well, the thrust of what I have been saying is that we need information so as to ensure that what our Prime Minister has been saying to us is in fact true. Now, I think we should be able to hold our Prime Minister up as an honorable gentleman who, when he says it is truly going to be by consent and voluntary, that you can opt in and opt out, that it should be so. The question is whether or not it is likely to be so, given the relationship between the IDB, from which we are borrowing $1.33 billion, the World Bank, and the United Nations. These are only questions that we're asked. No, the NIDS, as the Prime Minister has described it, is, I think, not disagreeable as long as it truly is by consent and you will not be penalized if you do not present a particular form of identity information or identification card. So I'm not suggesting at all that there should be a free-for-all and that there should be no ID. I'm not suggesting that we abandon the NIDS or that we do away with it. I'm suggesting that we haven't had a proper conversation, so that those questions which are being asked at this time are actually premature without the benefit of full information. Because how can we have gotten to this stage without having had this discussion about what has been happening globally, with all of this information coming as a surprise to us on the platform, and certainly as a surprise to the public of Jamaica? So that is the question. Can we please have answers to these questions? And then we can discuss whether or not we should have an ID at all. If it is that once we have an ID, we'll be moving inexorably towards ID 2020, ID 4D, and a database under the control of the United Nations.
Thank you. So we are not at all, at least I can speak for JCHS, we are not at all proposing that NIDS be done away with. We want to know more about the NIDS. We want to know, certainly I think Helene has been saying, we want to know if what the government says, they can really guarantee that that will be so, bearing in mind the financial obligations they have to other entities that want a global ID that's globally controlled. Will they be able to say no? We know that he who pays the piper calls the tune. And so this, I think are very valid questions that we need to know. And certainly we are not saying do away with IDs. We are saying we need to know more about this ID that is being proposed. Helene, one member of the audience would like you to repeat the title of the article and the author that you recommended.
Yes, this was Professor Sean, S-E-A-N, Sean Thorpe, He is the head of the School of Computing and Information Technology. I believe it was in the Gleaner. It could have been in the Observer, however, published in June of 2021. The title of the article was Defending Against Cyber Attacks. That's Defending Against Cyber Attacks by Professor Sean Thorpe, PhD.
Right, okay. Well, we have come to the end of our presentation, and as promised, we like to end on time. And so there may be a few other issues that are in the chat, and we will endeavor to note them. And if you have sent your email, then we'll try to probably get an answer to send them to you. Certainly, we appreciate your participation. The audience apparently was over 100. Well, it could not be, but some persons were not able to enter this chat because of the number 100. And so we are very, very appreciative of those of you who took the time to come and listen. And we hope that you'd have listened carefully. As I said, you'd have thought, you would think deeply and act wisely and ask penetrating questions of our leaders about what are you presenting to us and how can you guarantee that what you're presenting is what we will get. So I just want to thank everyone for attending this evening's Issachar Foundation Jamaica lecture. I want to remind you that you can email us your contact details so that we can inform you about upcoming events. Thank you very much once again, and especially thanks to Helene Coley-Nicholson for an erudite, comprehensive, and penetrating presentation, encouraging us to keep our eyes wide open about NIDS. Thank you very much, Helene, and thank you to everyone who